we've been covering the protests and demonstrations in Hong Kong, where now we are 10 weeks into the demonstrations that have taken place in that city. Last 3 days or so, protesters and demonstrators have taken over Hong Kong International Airport. They are protesting the concerns that demonstrators have over mainland China's influence in Hong Kong politics. The president was asked about that. The president said that he hopes it works out for everyone. He says that he hopes it works out for liberty, and he hopes it also works out for China. Two, I think, sentiments that probably do not go hand in hand when you're talking about mainland China. But those are the words of the President of the United States. And as we've been reporting for weeks, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets, first to force the government to end discussion of a controversial extradition bill. And later, after the city suspended that bill, they wanted the city's chief executive to resign and apologize for what they say has been an overly violent police response to mostly peaceful protests. So let's bring in CBSN contributor and Asia Society senior fellow Isaac Stone-Fish. He's joining me over the telephone to talk about this. So, Isaac, you've been probably following along to what we've been showing our viewers here, which is for the third straight day, protesters in Hong Kong taking over Hong Kong International Airport. The protesters, overall, the big concern, the big demand, there are several that they have that are very specific, but the main demand is they are extremely concerned over mainland China's influence in Hong Kong politics, in Hong Kong policies. Explain that influence that has happened gradually since the handover back in 1997.
Thanks, Vlad. So there's a lot of really deep frustration among many people in Hong Kong that Beijing has not kept the term of its agreement, which is called One Country, Two Systems. And while Hong Kong is a much freer place than anywhere else on mainland China, it is still a place where the long arm of Beijing is increasingly felt in the textbooks that people use, in the laws that the Hong Kong legislator is passing, and in the choice of chief executive. So Carrie Lam, who's been in office for the last several years, has become increasingly unpopular, and a lot of the protesters see her as a sign of some of the worst excesses of Beijing and want her out. And the protests, unfortunately, keep snowballing. Things that would have stopped the protests weeks ago are now no longer able to do that. And we are at a pretty fraught time right now because we don't know exactly how and when and how hard Beijing's going to respond.
And the question about that, Isaac, is interesting because there have been reports that near the border of Hong Kong, Chinese military vehicles had been spotted earlier throughout the course of the summer that these protesters were taking to the streets. And there, again, we're just looking at some pictures that are coming into us live. Sky News in the UK is reporting that the man that is at the center of the screen there that we're showing, Isaac, here is, wow, this is getting very violent. They are beating a man with a club. And what we've seen over the course of the last couple of days is violence from both police and what the police say are increasingly violent demonstrators. There have been reports, Isaac, that some police officers had infiltrated the protesters, the demonstrators, and Sky News reporting that at one point the man that we were seeing in the middle of our screens there was an undercover officer, at least reportedly an undercover officer, that the protesters had sussed out. But the fear from some is that Beijing, as it sees these pictures which are blocked from being viewed by its citizens over on mainland China, but as the government, the Communist Party, sees what we're seeing across our screens here, that they may choose to intervene, given that we are just a few months away from the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. How concerning is that for you as somebody who covers this part of the world?
I hate to say this, but it is very concerning, and you're right to bring up the 70th anniversary because a lot of the officials in Beijing who are managing the relationship with Hong Kong presumably don't want to have the protests going on when Beijing is trying to present a united front to its people and to the world that everything is fine and that people are happy with 70 years of Communist Party rule. And right now, there's still a possibility, still maybe even a decent to good possibility that things could de-escalate. And I think one thing we're seeing right now is still a battle between the Hong Kong protesters and the police in Beijing for public opinion. And really, whoever uses force first, whoever uses legal force first is probably going to lose that fight. So it's macabre, but it's almost as if, Beijing hopes that a police officer or an innocent bystander dies first before a protester, because that could really electrify one side or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fear that people have, Isaac, that we could see Beijing intervene, and my guess is it would be militarily, which a lot of people have said would be a disaster. In fact, Chris Patten, the last UK governor of Hong Kong, said that would be a catastrophe, not only for China, but obviously for folks living in Hong Kong.
It would certainly be a catastrophe. And another important audience for all this are the people of Taiwan, who live as if their country is independent. And a lot of people in the world think that Taiwanese deserve to have their own country, but Beijing claims Taiwan as part of China. And if Beijing cracks down too harshly on Hong Kong, that'll send a message to people in Taiwan that, if we rejoin the motherland, then this is the way that Beijing is going to treat us. So as Beijing debates how it wants to handle the situation in Hong Kong, they are mindful of the message that this will send to Taiwan.
Okay, so the pictures are frozen there. There is a picture there inside the terminal. Okay, it looks like some medical staff now, some medical folks, as evidenced by the red crosses on their vests there, are treating this individual that had been detained by some of the protesters, who at one point was being beaten as we were streaming that live here on CBSN, Isaac. And let's just point that out. The police have attempted to control the crowd using tear gas, rubber bullets when they were in the streets. Arrests here at the international airport. The protesters have responded by throwing the tear gas canisters back at police. Police officials say that 2 gasoline bombs were also reportedly thrown at officers. The police claim that protesters are using laser pointers offensively against them. And so this is the ratcheting of the tension that we've seen between the demonstrators and the protesters. But I wonder, as these clashes escalate, that if the protests continue like this, what kind of direction Carrie Lam is getting from Beijing? In other words, is Beijing giving a directive to Carrie Lam to is Beijing giving a directive to Carrie Lam to send those riot police out into the streets to contain them, or is the directive to pull back? We just don't know.
Yeah, that's such an important question, and it would be fascinating to find out exactly what the substance of the communication between Beijing and Chief Executive Lam is. But it does feel likely that Beijing doesn't have much faith in her ability to govern because of what's happening, and there are a lot of other levers of influence that they are pulling, and a lot of other ability for them to just directly intervene in Hong Kong. So I think, Lam is basically a lame duck right now, and if the situation is to de-escalate, it's probable that Beijing needs a different representative or another person inside the administration who can negotiate and who has far less of the baggage that she has for how she's handled the situation over the last couple months.
Isaac, do you see authorities in Beijing at all giving into the demands that the protesters have? I just want to give our audience, again, I'd mentioned them at the top of the hour, of the last hour, but I just want to give our audience a sense of what these demonstrations are all about. And I want to get a sense from you if you think that Beijing would at all acquiesce to any of these demands. So as we've been pointing out, and as you know, Isaac, this all began back in mid-June with that extradition bill that was introduced by the territory's chief executive, Carrie Lam. That extradition bill would have allowed prisoners and people accused of a crime to be extradited to mainland China. Ultimately, after those protesters took to the streets, Carrie Lam suspended that extradition bill, but the protesters want it officially withdrawn. So that's the first objective that they say that they have. They want a complete withdrawal of that proposed extradition bill. They want the government to withdraw the use of the word riot when talking about these demonstrations that are taking place. They want the withdrawal of that word. They want the unconditional release of protesters that have been arrested, and they want the charges against the protesters dropped. They want an independent inquiry into police behavior. They say police behavior has bordered on police brutality, and they want implementation of genuine universal suffrage. Do any of these objectives and proposals by the demonstrators seem to you to be something that Beijing would agree to?
The list you read goes from most likely to least likely. Universal suffrage is something that it would be shocking to see Beijing agree to at any point in the next several decades, while it's still under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the other issue is that while Taiwan is an important audience for this, there's also the student population in Beijing and Shanghai, which can surf the web relatively freely by jumping over the Great Firewall and can see pictures of the protests in Hong Kong and might think, well, okay, so Beijing yielded, my government yielded to these people in Hong Kong. Why aren't they yielding to my desire for more freedoms? So Beijing is walking on a knife point here between cracking down hard and radicalizing and frustrating another generation of Hong Kongers and alienating Taiwanese, while also fearing that if it's too lenient with the protesters, then people in Beijing and Shanghai are going to start demanding rights that, frankly, they all deserve.
Yeah, I mean, and I suspect that you're right. I mean, the suspension of that bill could possibly come if Beijing believes, I guess, that that this would end these protests. How likely is that?
I think it's likelier that they suspend the bill than the suspension of the bill ends the protest, because these have certainly morphed into something that is way beyond just the extradition bill right now. It is a fundamental struggle for freedom and liberty, and the people in Hong Kong are sick and tired of the way that their government and Beijing is treating them as, I don't want to say second-class citizens, I want to say less than citizens. They feel like they should be able to choose their own government, and they should be able to have a much larger say in how they rule. And the extradition bill was a piece of that, but it's so much bigger now.
You know, Isaac, and I may have missed this, but let me ask you. You and I spoke on the air as we looked back on the Tiananmen Square demonstrations. That began on April 15th of 30 years ago. 30 years ago, in 1989, we saw the beginnings of Tiananmen Square culminating in that the violent suppression of demonstrations that happened in Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989. We talked about that on the air. We looked back on that anniversary. If you recall the aftermath of Tiananmen, and while that was happening, President George H.W. Bush at the time denounced the actions in Tiananmen Square. He suspended military sales as well as high-level exchanges with Chinese officials. Many members of Congress, many members of the business community also condemned what was playing out across our screens in the West. President Trump was just asked about this on his way from his Gulf estate in New Jersey, and the president said this, quote, "The Hong Kong thing is a very tough situation, very tough. We'll see what happens, but I'm sure it will work out. I hope it works out for everybody, including China, by the way." There have been some who have called for President Trump to take a more strike a more vociferous note as to what is happening there. How far would that go if the President of the United States, like President George H.W. Bush, publicly condemned what we're seeing playing out on our screens there as far as the police crackdown on these demonstrators?
I think President Bush was far more mild before the massacre happened. And I think, unfortunately, we won't get to a point where we have to ask, what is Trump going to say after the Hong Kong massacre? But I think there's been frustration among some that Trump isn't doing more to condemn the violence. And in fact, people are pointing out comments he's made about Tiananmen Square, where he referred to the protesters there as rioters and said in an interview in the 90s that he appreciated how Beijing used strength and showed its strength to put down the protests. So I think many in the human rights community are doubtful, even though they appreciate some of the policies that President Trump has had towards China. I think a lot of them are frustrated by his response. And we saw candidate Senator Warren tweet something that was very supportive of the protests in Hong Kong, and I think a lot of people felt really appreciative that she did that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the massacre, which was a massacre in Tiananmen, is not this. These are demonstrators protesting with a set rule of objectives that they want to accomplish. So I'm not trying to draw direct comparisons, but Communist China is a country that, even though we have certainly broadened the relationship between the United States and China and the rest of the West with China, and as you point out, that China has supposedly implemented this one-state policy, but allowing Hong Kong to operate somewhat independently, that is why we're seeing these large protests, and that is why we have not seen China intervene directly. On the other hand, you can imagine that the full weight and force of the office of the presidency would carry some weight to at least let the police and the government officials in Hong Kong be aware that here in the United States, we value freedom of speech. Here in the United States, we value liberty and justice and the right for people to peacefully protest. And that we as the United States would want to continue to see that in countries around the world. And so the idea being that there would be at least one high-level voice, because we have seen the UK calling for an independent investigation into the protests. We've seen Canada's Justin Trudeau. We've seen Australia's Scott Morrison. They have voiced their concern, Isaac, at the handling of this political crisis in the wake of these airport protests. In fact, Justin Trudeau has called for a de-escalation of tensions, much, I guess, in the same way that the president, I guess, saying he hopes it all works out.
Vlad, I think you're exactly right. I do think that the calls by leaders to de-escalate the situation and to value the rights of the protesters, I think some people wrongly interpret those as meddling in China's domestic affairs, but it does give strength to the leaders who condemn these protesters, both domestically and in China. And I think there's frustration when people seem to play by Beijing's rules and don't call out Beijing for human rights abuses. And I do think, unfortunately, too, that the Tiananmen comparison is really the best one that we have for where the situation in Hong Kong could go. Hopefully it won't get there, and it is still very possible and probably even likely that things do de-escalate and there's no massacre, there's no, mass arrests, no curfew, no martial law. But this is a really fraught time for Hong Kong, and things really could unfold in devastating ways.
I want to point out to our viewers, Isaac, an editorial from the Washington Post. The headline of that editorial is "China has misread the Hong Kong protests from the start. It's time to get it right." This is by the editorial board. This is back. This is an editorial that was just recently published, August 12th. And one of the points that is made in the editorial is that Beijing is miscalculating in a number of ways, including the assumption that the protests would simply flare out. The Post argues that these protests are actually a genuine reflection of popular anger and a commitment to democracy, but that the authorities, by branding the protesters as terrorists and rioters, a law enforcement problem essentially to be handled by the Hong Kong police and not in a political manner, is probably a misreading of the commitment that these protesters have. What's your reaction to that?
I think a lot of the messaging that Beijing does is for domestic audiences. It wants to make them think that the Hong Kongers are ungrateful for their economic successes and that these are, unstable, unhappy fringes of the society that helped by black hands, they like to call them, in the U.S. and in Europe. And I think the Post reading on this is broadly correct. I will say, though, that perhaps the most important consideration as to what Chinese Chairman Xi Jinping is debating about this is something that we unfortunately have absolutely no insight into, which is the domestic political situation at the top of the Communist Party. So we don't know how she's being attacked about this by other members of the ruling Politburo Standing Committee. We don't know how the military sees the situation, and we don't know how this plays out in the power struggles that happen on a daily basis when you have a system like the Chinese Communist Party. So that could really be having a big effect on how Beijing is handling this situation. And unfortunately, we're just in the dark about that.
I want to point out, Isaac, that our viewers may be wondering, at one point we were showing live pictures coming in of a man that had been detained by the demonstrators there in Beijing airport, and that man was bound, and then at one point he was violently beaten. According to the Associated Press, the man may have been an undercover police officer, an undercover agent that the protesters uncovered, and because what the AP is reporting is at one point we saw the demonstrators removing the man's belongings from a backpack or from some type of a bag. And they found a blue T-shirt, and that blue T-shirt had been worn, or has been worn, according to the Associated Press, by pro-Beijing supporters, and the protesters said that that was evidence that he was a spy. So I just want to let our viewers know what the AP is reporting, because we were showing those pictures for quite some time of that man that had been detained by the protesters there in the airport on suspicion of being an undercover agent. At one point we saw this blue T-shirt, and according to the AP, that T-shirt is something that is worn by pro-Beijing supporters. Evidence that he's a spy. We don't know if he's a police officer. He may just be somebody who is a mainlander and supports Beijing. So I just wanted to clear that up for our viewers who are wondering who that individual was. Isaac, back to this editorial, because I think the editorial makes some good points, at least points that you and I can chew over. We were reporting earlier that Beijing has tried to paint these protesters as being under the influence of Westerners, Western influences, including the United States, by trotting out this sort of boogeyman that the protests are inspired by foreigners. In fact, we've seen Chinese state media that they are saying that this is what they call a color revolution instigated by the United States. And the Post goes on to say, quote, "The charge seems almost comical given President Trump's lack of sympathy for democracy movements anywhere in the world, but it speaks volume about the paranoia in the Communist Party that holds a monopoly on power in China. The protest movement is very much indigenous to Hong Kong and its people." In other words, to your point, it's not Beijing may be worried that this could translate to something in Taiwan. Maybe Taiwan is watching this, but this seems very much indigenous to Hong Kong and not necessarily something that would be transferable, these objectives that these protesters and demonstrators have, to Beijing.
I think I would disagree with the Post there. Hong Kong is a very global city, and there's a lot of Hong Kongers who have family in Canada or the U.S. or Europe or mainland China or Australia. And I don't think there's anything wrong with them being inspired by the democracies in those places and in them feeling that yes, it's great that certain people in the U.S. or Canada or Europe support what we're doing. And I think there's a fight for the soul of Hong Kong and the question of, are they looking towards Beijing or are they looking towards the rest of the world? And I think a lot of people in Hong Kong, while wanting to have a separate identity, not as Chinese, but as Hong Kongers, also feel like they would love to have values that are closer to the values shared in parts of the Western world.
And so how do you, I mean, I guess, Isaac, as we watch this play out, how do you see it playing out? I mean, we've been covering this since the summer. It doesn't look like there's any end in sight. It looks as if the protesters are holding fast, or holding steady to their demands. And as we look at these pictures coming into us now, things have calmed down considerably. It's after midnight there in Hong Kong now, but they could flare up at any time. I mean, how do you see this going forward?
You know, that's the million-dollar question there. And just like it would be so difficult to predict on May 15th, 1989, 2 weeks before the Tiananmen massacre, we're not going to be able to know what happens because I don't think that history has been written yet. It could be that Xi Jinping, if he's the one who is going to make the decision, decides that these protests need to be crushed by force and we see blood running through the streets of Hong Kong. Or it could be that he decides that this is a time when leniency is the best policy and that he and Hong Kong leaders and the protesters are able to sit down and work out some sort of accommodation that really calms things down. And I certainly hope it's the latter, but right now it is really possible that this ends very, very badly.
All right. Well, certainly, as you say, Isaac, our hope is that it does not end in a way that contributes to a loss of life. Again, as we've been reporting, the airport there in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong International Airport, has shut down departures, arrivals. Nothing happening there on the airport because demonstrators, thousands of anti-government demonstrators, anti-Beijing, if you will, government demonstrators, have occupied that airport using luggage trolleys to block travelers from reaching the gates, and so the airport is completely shut down.